couple days ago, we heard from Hillary Clinton after she gave an interview to The Guardian saying that immigration was giving rise to right-wing populists and Europe must stem mass migration. I find it funny that she's more concerned with people who are gaining power from saying they will address the problems of the common folk than actually talking about the issues caused by migration. About a week before this, however, John Kerry at an event said that Europe has been crushed by immigration and that it's caused some kind of transformation. And I've looked up various sources trying to understand what he means by this. And I don't exactly know. I mean, you could say that unemployment is caused by an influx of low-skilled workers, or you can take a look at what Trump said, that Europe's culture is being destroyed by all of these migrants that are coming in. Right now, in France, there are massive protests. A couple people have already died, and they're not directly connected. However, there is a light connection, which I found particularly interesting. People in France are protesting, are rioting over increasing diesel prices. And the gas prices are being increased because of a tax that Emmanuel Macron has put in place to encourage people to use other means of transportation to help fight climate change. And this ties back to what John Kerry said. The reason John Kerry said that Europe is being crushed by this migration and needs to do something about it is that he's actually talking about climate change, saying that Europe will face even more immigration, and they've already been crushed by the existing immigration. So today, let's take a look at these various stories and just talk about the general issue of whether or not Europe is facing real problems due to mass migration. But before we get started, please head over to patreon.com/Timcast if you want to support my work. Patrons are the backbone of the content I create, so if you like these videos and want to see more, then please go to patreon.com/Timcast and become a patron today. And heads up, I'm actually working on a plan for more on-the-ground reporting on top of the videos I already make, and I could definitely use your support. From the Daily Wire, just yesterday, John Kerry warns immigration has crushed Europe. Former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry admitted last week during a trip to Europe that the continent has been crushed by a transformation that has taken place due to immigration. Kerry made the remarks while speaking at a Guardian Live event at Central Hall in London, where he weighed in on a number of issues and also used the opportunity to bash President Donald Trump.
We're going to have climate refugees. Look at Europe. Europe's already crushed under this transformation that's taken place because of immigration. Germany, Angela Merkel, weakened because of it. And other places impacted. Italy significantly impacted its politics by immigration.
And his statement was published a week before we heard from Hillary Clinton in The Guardian, where she said, "I think Europe needs to get a handle on migration because that is what lit the flame. I admire the very generous and compassionate approaches that were taken particularly by leaders like Angela Merkel, but I think it is fair to say Europe has done its part and must send a very clear message. We are not going to be able to continue to provide refuge and support, because if we don't deal with the migration issue, it will continue to roil the body politic." I think it's interesting that people didn't really care that much about what John Kerry had to say, but now that Hillary Clinton has chimed in and talked about Europe ending mass migration, now John Kerry's statements become much more relevant. But John Kerry was talking about climate change. However, when I was looking through the news trying to understand what transformation he was talking about, the only thing I could really find were statements from far-right personalities and conservative personalities. Obviously, you have people associated with what they call the far right, whether that's a fair term or not, it's complicated, who are saying that Europe's culture is dramatically changing, but you also have Donald Trump and regular old conservatives saying Europe's culture is being displaced by mass migration. That's the only real transformation I can see, because you can't really say unemployment is a transformation necessarily. Unemployment waxes and wanes normally throughout the years and throughout the generations. But a transformation, well, there's a cultural transformation that Trump has called out. Is that what Kerry was referring to? I'd be kind of surprised if that was the case, but maybe it was. But what's interesting in all of this is how the riots we are seeing in France somehow actually do tie to what's going on. Right now in France, people are rioting. They're in one of the busiest tourist sections of Paris, and there are trucks on fire, and there are people throwing stones, and there are riot police launching tear gas, spraying people with hoses. And they're rioting because Emmanuel Macron increased taxes on diesel fuel to encourage people to use alternative means of transportation. And this ties back into what John Kerry said. John Kerry was talking about climate refugees. Now, the Daily Wire is a conservative outlet, and they focused more on the migration aspect of this. But here's what The Guardian had to say. Europe must tackle climate change or face migration chaos. The ex-US Secretary of State speaking at a Guardian Live event predicts mass movement from Africa. Europe faces even deeper political turmoil and the possibility of mass migration from Africa unless the world urgently addresses the threat of climate change, the former US Secretary of State John Kerry said on Thursday. Speaking at a Guardian Live event at Central Hall in London, he said he was deeply disturbed at how issues such as climate change, cyber wars, and the future of the oceans were not ballot box issues, admitting it was hard to translate these issues into an acceptable set of choices for voters. In the discussion with The Observer's chief political commentator, Andrew Rawnsley, Kerry said, "We are heading for catastrophe unless we respond to some life-threatening challenges very rapidly. We have a climate-denying president that pulls us out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement at a time when literally every day matters." They then go on to reiterate the earlier comment where he says that Europe is crushed under the transformation that is taking place due to migration. He says, "Well, imagine what happens if water dries up and you cannot produce food in northern Africa. Imagine what happens if Nigeria hits its alleged 500 million people by the middle of the century. You are going to have hordes of people in the northern part of the Mediterranean knocking on your door. I am telling you, if you don't believe me, just go read the literature." Kerry is trying to rile people up about climate change, but I do find it kind of funny that he's telling people the threat is immigration, that if you don't get a handle on climate change, there will be more refugees and more migrants, and he's right. It's just surprising to see someone typically associated with the left coming out and saying migrants are the repercussion of climate change. What I think he's trying to do, I think he's trying to speak to conservatives and warn them about something that may come if climate change is not a problem that is solved, right? I think often when we talk about climate change, it's framed in a way that speaks more to the left. And when you talk about environmentalism, the left is all on board, but conservatives are more interested in their country, patriotism, the economy, and a lot of what is proposed in terms of stemming climate change is damaging to the economy, which is now how we get into what's going on in France with these riots. Macron must resign. Furious protests at rising fuel prices across France. In a second week of demonstrations, thousands are protesting the steep rise in diesel prices brought by the president. The story says they are opposed to the taxes that Mr. Macron introduced last year on diesel and petrol, which are designed to encourage people to use more environmentally friendly forms of transport. The price of diesel has risen 23% in the past 12 months, while Mr. Macron's approval rating has sunk as low as 21% in recent opinion polls. Everything is kind of tied together. The protests, the riots that are happening in France are not directly about immigration. But if what John Kerry is saying is true, we can see that there is a weird connection here, that Macron is trying to deal with climate change issues, with carbon emissions, and by doing so, he's disrupted the economy, and it's resulting in riots from French citizens. What's going to happen if he doesn't do it? Well, according to Kerry, there will be more migrants. And look, I know there's a lot of people who are pro-refugee and think that you can just bring all these people in, but the reality is, first, let me just say I'm not an economist, but for the longest time, the left has been all about controlling immigration. Labor unions were all about controlling immigration because too many unskilled workers or low-skilled workers depress wages, and it's actually quite simple. If you have 100 available jobs and 1,000 people come in, they all compete for that job and continually offer to work for less because you need to work. And that's why unrestricted immigration is a bad thing, and that's why controlling for it makes sense. By all means, immigrants can help bolster the economy so long as it's controlled. But I need to go back to that statement from Kerry. Europe is already crushed under this transformation that is taking place due to migration. What transformation, though? In July, the Washington Post ran this story. Immigration is changing the culture of Europe, and its leaders better watch themselves. President Trump warned European leaders Friday that they better watch themselves because a wave of immigration is changing the culture of their countries. I think it's a very negative thing for Europe. I think it's very negative, Trump said. And I know it's politically not necessarily correct to say that, but I'll say it, and I'll say it loud. Trump's comments came during a joint news conference with British Prime Minister Theresa May in Ellesborough, England. Trump was asked to elaborate on comments published Thursday in the British tabloid The Sun, in which he said an influx of migrants fleeing violence and seeking asylum had changed the fabric of Europe. He said, "I think they better watch themselves because you are changing culture. You are changing a lot of things. You're changing security. Look at what's happening. I mean, you take a look at what's happening to different countries that never had difficulty, never had problems. It's a very sad situation. It's very unfortunate." I don't know if this is exactly what John Kerry was referring to, but I also don't know what other kind of transformation he's talking about. Maybe he's talking about populism like Hillary Clinton was. If that's the case, Hillary Clinton's opinion is very weird, Because it shows that she doesn't care what the average person thinks. She cares if other people can gain power by actually addressing the problems of the people. If the average person is concerned that mass migration is depressing wages and displacing workers, so they vote for populists who say, hey, okay, we'll control for immigration, Hillary Clinton isn't dealing with those issues. If that's what John Kerry's actually talking about, he doesn't care what the average person thinks either. Or maybe he's talking about what Trump said, a change in the culture and a change in security. Either way, regardless of the position, you now have former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry saying immigration is causing problems in Europe, both for presumably different reasons. Again, it's kind of unclear what John Kerry meant. The only transformation I can think of is what Trump is talking about from a cultural standpoint. But maybe the cultural shift is secondary. It's the populists, whatever the reason. He's talking about Angela Merkel losing power. You now have these elite Democrats saying that migration has caused problems in Europe, now iterated by two former U.S. Secretaries of State. It seems like politically, the far left narrative of open borders is failing, and more world leaders are saying migration is bad. I gotta admit, I'm really surprised to see John Kerry say that Europe was crushed by this transformation in Europe, whatever he meant by that. What do you think he meant by that? I don't know. I mean, maybe he's talking about right-wing populists, but that's kind of weird, a weird circuitous statement that doesn't really make sense to me. Comment below, let me know what you think. We'll keep the conversation going. You can follow me on Twitter at Timcast. Stay tuned. New videos every day at 4 p.m. and I'll have more videos up on my main channel, youtube.com/TimCastNews, starting at 6 p.m. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all next time.